Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. We pick up today. The daf is on. Wait, what's going on here? Wait, stop this and try again. Okay, all right. Fine. Hold on. All right, Boker Tov, everybody. We start today with. What's going on? We start today on Kuftet. Today's daf is Kuftet Zion 116. We pick up at the top of Kuftet Zion. Actually, we are a little bit ahead. So let me also review a point from yesterday, which maybe wasn't clear. The question in the Gemara is that first of all we were dealing with issues about witnesses testifying to certain specifics around the death of a man and whether the woman could remarry, the wife could remarry. And on the one hand, a concern that when the woman is reporting it, she might have been reporting stuff based on impressions and not concrete facts, Amr b'dami, or she drew certain conclusions, which maybe she's not even aware that she's drawing those conclusions, and she's stating them as facts. But then the Gemara goes on to discuss times when, look, we don't always have the fact, and sometimes maybe we can't. Even if we know we know the concrete facts, we won't have all of them, and maybe we are entitled to draw certain conclusions. And that was questions about drawing drowned man out of the water and a charred body, etc. So now the Gemara deals with something which I think intersects those two issues, deals with a case about a message that was sent that Yitzchak Reish Galusa, the son of the sister of Rav Bibi, died. And the question is this the person that we know of that name? So on the one hand, it's relevant because it's a question about testifying to somebody's death and us being able to act on the information. But it's also relevant because it's a question about knowing certain facts and drawing certain conclusions, right? We have the facts of the person's name. Is that enough context in order to allow us to sort of assume who that person is? Now, of course, what is funny about that story is that we're dealing with this Reish Galusa, who is, the head of the Exilarch there. It does not seem how many Reish Galusas were there. So I really don't understand that. Maybe they didn't say he was the Reish Galusa. I really can't understand that. So we're going to
that term was used for
broadly
a
applied.
variety of people.
So
Yes,
maybe that's it. So
in different
local
yeah.
rulers. Okay, so it has to be something like that, or else it doesn't really make any sense. So maybe it is a more not a single, not referring to the single race Galusa, but some type of a other type of a political
Still
official.
the son of the sister of the
Right. So
Rabbi.
still, there's a question: how many people fit that description? Anyway, so then the Gemara introduces a debate of Abaye and Rava about whether we're concerned with somebody else with that name and whether we would have to check the entire region in order to make sure that there is nobody else of that name. And it gives an example here about, let's pick up from this again from the bottom because it'll reorient us and also I want to clarify a point that I did not make yesterday. So the Gemara says like this. Amar Bayi, Mina Minallah. So we're about 10 lines from the bottom on Kuf Tet Vav Amud Bet, the line right above the little aleph in parentheses. Amar Bayi, Mina Minallah. Where do I know to say that we're concerned that somebody else might have the same name? The Hu Gita Tishtakach bin Naharda, there was a get found in Narda, Vikasiv Bitzad Colonia Masa, by the side of Colonia, the city, Ana Andru Linoi Naharda, I Andru Linai of Naharda, Pataris Vatarichi says Plonis Intiti. I have divorced so and so, my wife. And that was it. So he identified himself under an lie. He was from the city of Naharda. We knew the name of his wife. So, and we presumably knew somebody who matched that description. And nevertheless, although we knew somebody who matched that description, the father of Shmuel sent it to Rabbi Yehuda Nisiya, the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and wanted to know: do we have to worry that there might be somebody else that fits that description, or can we go based on the person that we know that we assume it's referring to? And he said back to him, you have to check all of Naharda to determine that there is nobody else. You cannot just assume, oh, I know that guy. You have to make sure that there is no one else. So in general, you are concerned that there might be somebody else who fits that description.
Her name was not written in there?
It was. So it's not only his name and his name place, but also the name of the wife. But maybe there's somebody else that matches those details. The Rava Amar, and Rava says, no, that can't really be the requirement, because Im Isa, if we are concerned about that, it's not enough to check Narda. You need to check the whole world, because maybe there's a guy that used to live in Naharda and fits that description, and now he's living somewhere else. So therefore, you have to go. So it's sort of like an Ein L'Davar Sof. Ella, there really was not that requirement. And he told it because the father Shmuel asked a question. He didn't want to say a stupid question. He said, "Fine, go ahead, check it out." But really, there would be no requirement. So that's Rava's position, that there really is no requirement. If it looks like somebody, the name fits, then wear it. I'm a Rava. You know, I mean, a lot. Where do I know this? That I say that you don't have to worry. The Hanu Trey started enough to be Mechuza, two writs of debt that came out in Mechuza, which is Rava city. The Kazi Bahu, and it was written on them, Chavi bar Nanai, Vinanai bar Chavi. Two names which clearly were very popular. Chavi, the son of Nanai, John, the son of Fred, and Fred, the son of John. Okay, so these were the names, pretty popular names. And the question is now, I explained this yesterday. Is that word misexplained? That these are not the names of both the creditor and the debtor. These are just the names of the creditor. So the creditors were had very common names, and they were the ones, people who had these names, were the ones that had the get. The get. Let's say it has two writs of debt coming from one guy by the name of John Smith and the other guy by the name of, what's another common name?
John Doe.
John Doe. Well, Joe isn't such a common name. Anyway, and these are the people that are holding these writs, and they have the writs. They are the creditors. Their names match the name in the document, but they're very common names. Now, the name of the debtor presumably is not so common. So presumably, there is no question who the debtor was, because what we're going to speak about now is whether the circumstances can clarify that this genuinely is the creditor. Right? The question never is discussed. How do we know who the debtor was? So I explained that yesterday. It actually is assumed that the debtor is very clear and very explicit. There's no question about it. But given that these names are somewhat common, can we really assume that the person holding it is genuinely the creditor? Now, you realize that this is not exactly like the earlier cases. The earlier cases, we were dealing with uncommon names where we did not know that anybody else had the same name. But on the other hand, there was no supporting evidence. It was a random letter we got that so-and-so died. It was a get that we found on the street. Here, we're dealing with common names where we know that other people have the same name. Go open up a phone book, you'll find other people with the same name. So we know there are other names. But on the other hand, there's supporting evidence because it's being held by the person that has that name. So it's a somewhat of an analogy of these different cases. And Rashi makes that point. So if you look at Rashi, Rashi says, well, let's read the Gemara and then we'll read Rashi. Va'adi behu Rava bar Avua, Zuze, and Rava bar Avua, whatever, used it to collect. He accepted these documents and he had the people pay out the money, even though there could be a claim that this wasn't the real creditor. There are a lot of people with those names, and nevertheless, he said we don't have to worry about it. So here Rashi, right. So here Rashi makes the analogy: you're supposed to have a high degree of identification, I suppose. So yeah, but here Rashi says okay, so here's the analogy. This is a case where it's only about money, and we know that there definitely are people with other names, and nevertheless we're not worried about it. Okay, other people with the same name. I'm sorry, with the same name, and nevertheless we're not worried about it. So I'm not going to say that you'll have the same standard when it comes to allowing a woman to remarry. They'll have to have a higher standard. But if when it comes to money, we don't care, even though we know there are people with the same name, then when it comes to allowing a woman to remarry, we shouldn't care as long as we don't know there's somebody with the same name. Okay, so it's a weird type of an analogy because obviously you could make differences between them. But the point just is we don't always worry about other people, about the possibility that's referring to someone else. So here we don't worry about it. Now we do have the supporting evidence that the guy is holding it onto it, which is what Rabbi is going to retort. But here we don't worry about it, even though we know that there are other people with the same names. So certainly, at least when it comes to allowing a woman to remarry, we shouldn't be concerned with it. At least in a case when we don't concretely know that there's somebody else who has the same name.
So let's say it's John Smith and Jane Smith has her get, and they're very
right. So the case before was that the get was found on the ground, right? So that made it less of an issue. Here it's being held. But Michael's point is right. Like according to a Rabbi that is concerned at what point do you stop being concerned, right? So presumably, Rabbi hasn't told us, but presumably you need like a lot more. What is the degree that we say like 2 pieces of picture ID? Right? What is the degree where we say that is sufficient identification? We don't have to be concerned. Okay, so that's a good question, but certainly like general simple identification, Rabbi is concerned. So anyway, this is Rava's point. So you see, even though we know there are people with the same name, it's fine at least when it comes to money. So we should say something similar when it comes to letting the woman remarry.
Why can't the debtor just identify the creditor?
Maybe he did not.
Party,
Maybe he's denying it. Maybe it's a third party. Maybe he's not around. But yes, that's a good question. Rabbi would say back. No, they're supporting evidence. What do we need to be concerned about? If it's that he dropped, maybe the original creditor dropped it and this guy picked it up. Miser zarbe. People are careful with their writs of debt. If we're concerned that maybe he gave it to this other guy to watch for him and this guy is now stealing it essentially. So no, even the shmei kishmei lo mafki gabe. Nobody is stupid enough that if they have a IOU written out to them, that they would have somebody else with the exact same name as them watch it for them. Okay, because there got to be somebody else you could get to watch it for you. So Maya Martha. So what do you want to say? Dioma Masale, maybe he gave it to this guy and he actually intended to sell it to this guy, but he did not actually complete the sale, and therefore that's the problem. So this guy had got it not because it was dropped, got it because he intended to buy it, but maybe the sale hasn't completed. No, Osius Nicholas from once he gave it over, that does complete the sale, so there's no case to be concerned about. So Bai basically says there's nothing to be concerned about in that case. Obviously, if the guy's holding on to it, we know that it's his. This, by the way, gets to other types of questions in Baba Metzia and elsewhere. The whole problem of, I'll just tell you a fascinating question that Tosfos asks. Tosfos says, I don't understand. In all Dinei Mamanis, we have the principle that Chazaka Masha Tachas Yaradam Harehu Shalom. Right, that what you're holding on to is assumed to be yours. So why do we have to have this whole explanation of no, he wouldn't have given it to someone else? Or no, why don't we just say that the fact that he's holding on to it allows us to assume that it's his, and 9/10 of the law, and that ends there. So Tosfos says yes. You know what's assumed to be his because he's holding on to it? The piece of paper. Okay, you want to keep the piece of paper? Be my guest. But to treat it as a document, to treat it as a writ, to treat it as testimony that you have the right debt, it's not enough to say you own the physical piece of paper. There needs to be something that says, that basically, says that this is testifying about you. And that leads to the interesting point about things like a get and a shtar chov and so on, which is that they actually are testifying to the person that is bearing that is presenting it. And that's so part of the issue here, and part of an issue that comes up in Bava Metzia as well, is the difference between, like before when we talked about a get that was found. If it's found on the street, how much is it just a piece of paper and how much is it doing an act of testifying? Part of what gives the shtar the power to speak, to act as a type of a written testimony, to be seen as it's testifying, is that it's being presented by the right person, by the person who it's written out to, and therefore that's basically part of what Abaye's response is. Abaye's response is if a get is found, I'm going to be concerned about who it's talking about. If a guy is presenting a document and his name matches, and it is doing an active job of testifying for him, and therefore we're not going to be concerned.
So you don't have to worry about whether the shtar chov is Adim and asking the Adim.
What? Yeah, you don't have to talk to the Adim, exactly. Okay.
In case of the Picadon, gave it the Shemei Kishmei lo Mafki Gabe.
That maybe this guy isn't the creditor, but the creditor asked him to watch it for him, and then said no creditor would be stupid enough. That's a guy with the same name watch his document for him. Okay, so this is the debate of Abaye and Rava. How much are we concerned by Mamanis when we know that there's somebody else with the same name, and by Easter when we don't know that there's somebody else with the same name? How much are we concerned that if we know a guy that matches the description, that we can assume that's the guy? Or how much do we need to go ahead and to prove it? Or alternatively, to make sure our documents have a much higher degree of specificity and of identification.
And in the case of the Adim with the get, right, where you have to search the whole world or whatever it is, I guess it must be a case where the Adim aren't around. Otherwise, you can just ask them.
Well, that's a good point. Yes, if they're Adim, you could ask them. That's true. Now, this in general is a principle, like I said, that comes up in other Gemaras. It's called Huchsaku Trei Yosef ben Shimon. When we know that there are two people with the name of Yosef ben Shimon in the city, what do you do with documents made out to Yosef ben Shimon? Okay, so that's when it's Huchsaku, and that's a Dinei Mamanis question. This is a question primarily about Isser, about remarriage, where it's not Huchsaku. And nevertheless, do we have to worry about it? So let's take a look at the case. Okay, Hahu Gita. So now we're back to a get. Yishtakach b'sura that was found in Surah. So we've had Naharda, Mechuza, and Surah. We're doing our whole, touring of cities in Bavel, right? So there was a get found in Surah. V'kasi be'hachin. Here's what it was written: B'sura mata, in the city of Surah. Ana, I, Anan Barchia Naharda, Anan Barchia from Naharda. Patarit v'tarachis plonis entity. I've divorced so and so, my wife, Sarah, my wife. So it was a guy from Naharda that was writing the get in Surah. Ubadku rabbanim misura v'ad Naharda, and the rabbis checked from Surah to Naharda. So presumably they protect both cities. V'lo have anan barchia achrina lebarmi anan barchia michigra dahave b'Naharda. Okay, and so they had one guy. What's not a little clear about it is they had one guy who they assumed it was talking about, right? And that was the guy they knew. Yeah, everybody knows Chanan, whatever, Chanan Barchia of Naharda. They assumed they knew it was talking about, but they wanted to make sure they were following, Abayi's approach, and they wanted to make sure there was nobody else who might have matched that description. And from between Surah and Naharda, they found one other guy who matched that description. Okay, Anan Barchia, who Lebarme Anan Barchia Mechigra Dehavit ben Naharda, and he was from Naharda, so that's Anan Barchia from Naharda.
Wait, what's this?
What? I'm sorry, Michagra. I'm sorry. He was from Chagra, but he had been, in Naharda. Okay, so he was Chagra was his city of origin, but he had been in Naharda. Presumably, his wife's name also matched the wife's name of the get. So they found somebody else other than the guy they assumed it was who matched the description. Okay, the only thing was that he was in Naharda. And remember, the get's at that time, and remember, the get says it was written in Surah. Okay, the Asu Samri Sadi the Amr, and 8 witnesses came and said that he was with us in Naharda. Okay, so this guy was named as Anan Barchia from Chigra, although presumably he was now taking up residence in Naharda, and there was testimony that he was in Naharda at that date. Okay,
In Surah.
no, the witnesses said he was in Naharda on that date. Okay, and the get was written in Surah. Okay, so you get the case.
Yeah.
Get was written in Surah. It identified a person. We assumed we knew who that person was. We found another person who basically matched the description. He was residing in Naharda, so when he described himself as me Naharda, that could match. Okay, even though he originally was from this place called Chigra. Presumably his wife had the same name. So we found another guy who matched the description, other than the guy. But we know that he wasn't in Surah on the date that the get says it was written in Surah.
And
They
both divorced their wives. I mean,
No.
ask them?
Yeah, well, that's always the question. Why not ask the wife? And,
Yeah.
if one wife says she did receive it and the other wife said she didn't receive it. I know that's always the question about what else are we finding out or not finding out about this case. Let's take a look at what the Gemara says. Okay, Amar Abai, so said Abai, the point might be is that, and again, this gets to the question about to what degree does this document is about circumstantial evidence or does the document have to be testifying? Let's say this other guy says, no, I never divorced my wife. And the wife says, no, he never divorced me. And the guy we thought it was says, I divorced my wife. And she says, yes, he did divorce me. So is that going to be enough? Or do we say, since the document itself doesn't testify to that fact, we can only sort of assume that fact based on additional, testimony and evidence? Do we really have testimony that she's divorced? Right? It raises interesting questions. All along, what we've been dealing with in Yevamot is not formal testimony that the woman's husband has died. Right? We've been dealing with circumstantial evidence, better or worse circumstantial evidence. So it does raise those interesting questions. Now we're going to get, not to death, okay, but it does raise questions about how much is it about evidence and how much is it about testimony. But Michael does ask a very important question, which has to be addressed. What's everybody else saying? Anyway, let's take a look. We've got this guy whose name matches, but he was in Naharda, and the get says he was in Surah. So do we have to be concerned about it or not? So, okay. Even according to me, that in general, I'm concerned with other people with the same name, that I normally am concerned. And here, you actually checked. Rabbi says, I only say you got to check. You did your job. You checked. And all we found was one guy. We don't have to worry about this one guy because we know what his story was. The witnesses say he was in Narda. What would he be doing in Surah? At the same time, they said he was in Narda. So Rabbi said, I would have said, yes, you do have to check. But then when you go ahead and check, then if you know that if you can eliminate people, then you can eliminate them. So that you found a guy with the same name, but you were able to eliminate him. So it's not a problem. You did your job. Great. Let's move on. That's what Abai would say. I'm a Rava. Now Rava could say the opposite. And even I, who normally wouldn't have told you to bother to check, I'm not concerned with people with the same names. Now that you found a guy with the same name, I am concerned. What about the fact that we could eliminate him because better not to have checked? But now you found a guy with the same name, you can't ignore him. What about the fact that he was in Naharda and the get was written in Surah? So Dilma begamla parcha. Maybe he was in Narda when the witnesses said he was, and then he got on a flying camel, okay, a magic carpet, a speedy camel, and maybe he managed to get to Surah in time to write the get, okay? Inami bikfitza, or he just did a big jump. So Tosa says that means, Rashi says it means with with some type of magic in the name of a shade or a shame or something. I don't know. It sounds like he's saying absurd. It sounds like once you have a concrete knowledge of another person, then you have a concrete doubt and you cannot eliminate that doubt. Again, which is pretty funny. But yes, at this point, you would say it doesn't matter even if it's logically impossible. The knowledge of a concrete other person makes a problem. But the last one makes it a real reasonable reason why to be concerned. Inami, wait, let's read the third one, which makes it the most reasonable reason. Inami, mili masa. Just because he was in Naharda doesn't mean that a get wasn't being written for his name in Surah. Okay, you don't have to be physically present when the get is being written. Like Rav said to the scribes, and Rav Huna said, if you're writing a get in Shili, ksovu b'Shili, say that this get was written, in Shili, even though the husband was actually afagav de mimser mili behini, even though the husband told you in Hini, right? He told you in Boston, write this get for my wife, and you happen to be in New York. So the name place you put in the get is New York, is where it's being written, not where the husband said. Even though, and here's the point, the language of the get is first person and the husband speaking, right? The language of the get is, I, John Smith, from so-and-so, divorced my wife, blah, blah, blah. So even though it's the voice of the husband, you write the place not where the husband commanded you and where the husband is, you write the place where you are found, okay? So and then the reverse. Okay, so anyway, so Rava says just because it says that that here in Surah we are writing this get does not mean the husband is in Surah, which is a very reasonable position. If that's really true, that was the practice, one wonders why Abaye could feel otherwise, right? And the fact that it names the place is completely irrelevant. The husband could have been somewhere else. Okay, but what you do find out is that Abaye and Rava, when it comes to get and when it comes to messages that a guy has died, right? Abaye is generally concerned that he needs a higher standard to know we're talking about the right person. And Rava says that in general, you don't have to worry if somebody else might have the same name. If you concretely find somebody with the same name, then Rava might say, then you got a real problem. It's a lot harder to eliminate somebody once you know, even if maybe the evidence does point to eliminate it. And then the Gemara ends up, my havele de shumshami, going back to the case which we had thought was completely bracketed. What happened to the whole case of the sunflower seeds? Do we have to be concerned that they're different sunflower seeds or not? Rav Yemar Malo Chayshinu, we're not concerned. Ravina Mar Chayshinu, we are concerned. V'Hilchas Chayshinu, and we are concerned. Again, in a mumminous case, when there's sort of less maybe identifying marks. So all of this is applying to like 3 or 4 different cases, each one that could have its different level of standards, right? The sunflower seeds, same barrel, but you know the weight, as opposed to a guy who has certain identifying marks on his body and he was drowned. I mean, really, those are going to be the same circumstances and the same standards. Or, a get that has names as opposed to a writ of debt, when you know there are guys with the same name, when you don't know there are guys with the same name. A lot of different cases about what can you do to determine you're talking about a particular thing or a particular person, and in the end, what really are the rules, we don't know. And also, as Michael says, why aren't we looking at other types of supporting evidence? So a lot of that was again, maybe we need to, and it's funny, the Gemara sometimes isolates particular aspects in order to clarify that halacha, and then but if there's other evidence, then we'll need to discuss that. But it also might be an interesting question about the difference between evidence versus testimony, right? We know that by the death case, we don't need formal testimony, but by get, maybe we do, and maybe it's a different discussion. Again, the Gemara is not really clarifying the potentially different standards that are at play here. Yes, so.
Yeah, isn't it possible to read the line "Bagamla Parcha" sarcastically?
Well, that's sort of what Michael was saying. But if it were sarcastic, then why would it be relevant? Then why would we have to be concerned about it? So it might be sarcastic in the sense that it doesn't really matter. Once we know there's another guy with the same name, then we can't ignore him, right? That could have been. Except the last possibility of Mili Muster makes a really reasonable type of concern.
Like these days, if a woman has a get,
yeah,
we're not going to be like.
Well, again, if the get is coming produced by the person who it's written in the name of, that's a more obvious case. All these other cases was the get was found on the ground, which is why Rava's example about the guy with the writ of debt producing it. Abai said if the guy's producing the writ itself, then it's a much more obvious situation.
So in the case of the Ishtaka Basura means like so they found it on the floor.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
Sesame seeds.
What?
Yeah,
Sesame seeds.
What did I say?
Sunflower.
Oh, I kept on saying sunflower seeds. Oh, I'm so sorry.
It
That
changes
changes everything. We got to go back. That's right. It's sesame seeds. I forgot. Sesame seeds are probably a lot more valuable than sunflower seeds, I think. Anyway, all right. Go back. Change everything. Everything I told you yesterday was wrong. It's sesame seeds. All right, moving on. Okay. So that's the first case in the Mishnah where if there's a war in the world, we don't believe her, not because we think she's intentionally lying, but we think she has made certain, she might be misinterpreted the fact, what happened. But if there's peace in the world, but they are fighting, then we're concerned that she might, then there's a different concern. Either she intentionally lied or she is more willing to interpret, vague information that he's dead because that's what she'd like him to be dead anyway. So that also raises the possibility that she might be intentionally lying.
What about she has a large insurance policy?
So, okay, that's a good question too. You could write, that actually would be a great thing, like to write one of those like murder mysteries based on these prakim, exactly the scenarios in the Gemara, like people do haikus based on the daf. We could do like a murder mystery based on it. Okay, so what would be evidence that they're fighting, the couple? So she tells her husband, I fed up with you. Just give me a divorce already. Okay. So that that's what the woman is saying to her husband, that would satisfy this standard in terms of then she reports that he died. So Kulu Nami Amr Hachi. What are you talking about? All women say this to their husbands. So Rashi says when they're angry and fighting. Okay. So everybody, this is a common thing. That's sort of like, again, like those cases where somebody says, I'm gonna kill you, I could kill him. Do you use that as supporting evidence that he was the murderer? So anyway. So okay.
Cases right now, by the way. Like threats, like online, Facebook.
Yeah. And then somebody winds up dead.
No, not necessarily dead.
Okay.
Whatever.
All right, fine. Anyway, so people say that very often. What does that prove? Maybe they're just angry. I'm sorry. So no, what she says is my husband has already divorced me. She's going around saying, yeah, I'm divorced from him. Okay, so and the fact that she's making that claim, even though we sort of know it's false, is enough to show us that she really is fed up and sick with her husband and she'd like to be divorced from him. So the Gemara says, if that's what she's saying, let's just believe her before we get to the guy being dead. Let's believe her that she is divorced. Meet Rav Hamnuna, based on the statement of Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna, a woman who says to her husband that you have divorced me, she's believed. A woman would not be brazen enough to say that straight to her husband's face if it weren't true. Of course, one wonders, what's the husband saying? If the husband says you're lying, right? I mean, so that's still you believe her and so on. But anyway, there is a statement of Rav Hamnuna that a woman is believed when she says this. So if that's what determines that they're fighting, who needs a whole question about being believed about the guy dying? She should just already be believed that she's divorced. So the Gemara says, finally a case that'll satisfy Michael that we actually start doing a little more investigation. She says, you divorced me in front of Reuven and Shimon. And then we go ahead and ask Reuven and Shimon, and they say she's totally making it up. It never happened.
And she doesn't have it again.
And she doesn't have it again. But the very fact that she's making that claim shows that she has basically checked out of the marriage, and she's not interested in being in being married to her husband anymore. And then if she claims he's dead, then we can't believe her.
So we don't believe her that she's divorced. We're just wondering if he's really dead.
Right. So, of course, the question that Tosas raises is, if it's already been established that she's lying when she says that she's divorced, because the witnesses said that she's made it up, then why doesn't that, like, completely prove that we can't believe her when she says that
He's
the
dead, yeah.
husband is dead? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's take a look at the next line. Which those women,
We're saying is she really
okay, so it says like this. I mean, obviously there could be other ways of proving that they're always yelling at each other every single night or something, right? Okay, but anyway, let's take a look. So my time at Diktata, what's the reason that when they're fighting, she's not believed? So Rav Chanina Amar Mishum de Mishakra, because she'll intentionally lie. Okay, now intentionally lie, what good is that going to do if the husband is going to show up? But Rashi has told us before, yes, but then she'll have been sleeping with another man, which maybe she wouldn't have the chutzpah to do if based into the paskin that the husband was dead. And then the husband shows up, and because she's been sleeping with another man, she can't go back to her husband, so she'll manage to get the divorce in the end anyway. Rav Shimi bar Ashi Amar Mishum de Amar b'didami. She's not intentionally lying, but since she's fighting with her husband, she's much more inclined to interpret the information that he is dead. Okay, that's what she'd like to see anyway. So that's sort of which she projects it a little bit. Okay, or it colors her reading of the circumstances. So my benayu, what would be a difference between this? Top of kuftet dynamite bet. Ika benayu, the argil who kitata, that he is the reason that they're fighting. It's clear that he's doing things to annoy her, that she would love them to be reconciled and to be married. So presumably, I don't know, she's not going around saying that they're divorced. So it must be a different circumstance. Anyway, he's to blame. So if he's to blame, we're not concerned that she's lying. It's clear she wants to stay married. But what we are concerned is that she was still, because things are still uncomfortable in the marriage and difficult in the marriage, that might influence subconsciously her interpretation of the facts. But she certainly wouldn't be consciously lying in this case. Okay, so now if you take a look at Tosfos, the last of the wide lines, like 5 lines from the top, he says Vim Tomer, 4 lines. That my lote shaker. Look, the Tosfos on the Amud Bet, 4 lines from the top. V'amai lo tishaker. Why wouldn't we be concerned she's lying even in the case when he's to blame? V'alohi mishakeret. We already know she's lying. Shemer gave her stein b'fnei ploni ploni v'shalina levamu lo hayu dvar me'olam. Right? If we're assuming the same circumstances, that she claimed she was divorced and the witnesses say it's not true, then we know she's a confirmed liar. So even if he's to blame, that should still remain a concern. So the Gemara says, it's one thing to lie to say I'm divorced, but to say that my husband is dead, we know from an earlier parak all of the negative consequences that are going to be heaped on her if she claimed her husband was dead and it turns out he's alive. So that far she won't go, to lie if he's the guy to blame and if he's the reason for the fights and not hers. So it's a little bit convoluted, but basically, it is interesting based on the Gemara, how the Gemara set up the circumstances. It was a case that she was confirmed to have lied. Okay, but it's funny why that had to be the case of knowing that they're fighting. There's so many other potential circumstances that we could establish that the marriage is on the rocks, right? And the Gemara gave a very concrete case, but she was also a confirmed liar. Okay, but bracketing that, so it also tries to explain why that's not as consequential as lying about death. Okay, but nevertheless, the question is it really a concern of intentional lying, or is it a concern just about misinterpretation? And the difference would be if it's not that she wants him dead, if not that, that she wants out of the marriage, but that he wants out of the marriage.
It's a high threshold. In other words, the marriage can be really terrible, but not totally on the rocks, such as katata. Katata really is like that's it.
The funny thing is though that katata does not sound. Katata
the word itself
is like it's like fighting,
exactly.
So it's not clear, right? When the Gemara gives the example that she claims she's divorced, like what would that equal if she doesn't claim she's divorced, but like every night we hear them arguing? I mean, it doesn't help us in terms of normal circumstances as what is the measure, of this. Now the Gemara asks, like it did by the case of Milchama, what about when it's not the woman, but it's an objective Eid Echad? And here it's clearer why it would be better. By the case of Milchama, where there's the fog of war, what difference does it make Eid Echad or not? So we had to say, well, if he's an outside objective witness, maybe he'll be more precise. But here, since clearly some of this has to do with her, with her emotional, investment, the state of the fact that they're fighting with one another and they're angry at one another and so on, and that'll lead either to intentional lying or to unintentional misinterpretation. So a third unrelated party, should totally be believed. So that's the question the Gemara asks. Let's say we know that the couple has been fighting and the marriage is on the rocks, and a third party says that the husband died. So the answer should obviously be okay. Let's see what the Gemara says about that. Ibailu, they raised the question. Eid echad b'ktata mahu. Do we believe in Eid echad when the marriage is on the rocks? My time of Eid echad mehem. And do we say what's the reason that one Eid is believed? Mishum demilza David gluye la meshakir. Somebody won't lie about something that the facts will come to the surface. Hachanami lo meshakir. Here too, if the husband isn't dead, he'll show up, and so this guy's going to be careful before making the claim. Do we say time of Eid echad mehem mishum dehi daiko mitzvah? Maybe the reason the Eid echad is believed is always because it assumes the backup that she's going to be double careful before listening to the aid, because she doesn't want to have to deal with the consequences if it turned out he was wrong, right? Remember all those big consequences from the previous parak. So if every testimony of an Eid echad needs her backup, you can't rely on her backup here, right? So now here that since the marriage is on the rocks and they're fighting, she's not going to bother to do her job of the backup and to also investigate. Take it. So the Gemara says we don't know. So now it's really complicated, right? Because now in times when the marriage is in bad state, or in case of war, not only can you not believe the woman, but you might not be able to even believe a different party. Now, just imagine that, right? Imagine that, let's say you had the case of 9/11, right? Or you had cases of war, whatever. Not all marriages so they go through bumpy patches, right? And not all marriages are in a great situation. Now, all of a sudden, you can't believe not only her. A guy comes back from the battlefield in the Israeli army or whatever and says, I saw him die. You can't believe him because we know that the marriage was on the rocks beforehand, right? So or even if it's not a Muhammad case, right? Guy just says I was on a trip with a guy and I saw him die. We can't believe him, right? So obviously this raises serious questions about using these solutions of for aguna problems that the rabbis came up with. That now they get severely limited the scope of them. Right, so it's so if we define now, maybe you could say we could define ketata very narrowly. That's the benefit of defining ketata very narrowly, is that it'll be very hard to claim that any marriage is really in the ketata scenario that the Gemara describes. But we also describe Muhammad pretty broadly, right? And a lot of times people are reporting back it's because a building fell down and there was a fire and there was some tragedy, and those would be a plane went down. Those would be the ketata types. Those would be the Muhammad types of scenarios. So the ability to believe Eid echad in those cases is pretty important.
What do we do?
I don't know. We have to. That's a much more. We have to give a practical shir on how poskim have dealt with these scenarios, because these are the scenarios. Yeah, there's a whole book that came out about 9/11 and the psakim that came after 9/11, and then there was the psakim after the Holocaust, and these are regular case areas of halacha about poskening about the death of the husband. Okay, let's take.
By daika b'mitzvah.
She investigates before, and then she gets married. But first she investigates.
She would investigate first.
First, right.
Remarry someone else.
Exactly. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, L'olam eina ne'emenes. Rabbi Yehuda says she will not be believed even in the time of peace and even if the marriage is good, unless she comes in with her garments rent and crying and her, and all this other evidence. So Atanya, they said to him, Amrullah Rabbi Yehuda, they said to Rabbi Yehuda, Varecha pikechas tinase. If a woman is smart, then she can get remarried because she'll know how to act, right? She's a good actress. And she knows that she needs to act. Shota lotinase, and if a woman isn't smart and she's just following, following the normal rules of the system, but she's not trying to scheme or to, then she won't be allowed to remarry. You're just encouraging people to act. Ella achazu b'achazutinase. In other cases, she can get remarried. We cannot say that it depends on how the woman is acting. And now a woman came to the Beis Din, Rabbi Yehuda, who would only believe her if she was clearly in, sort of in mourning and wailing and so on. Amile, and people said to her, here's what you got to do, honey, before you walk into that building. Safti ba'alech, first start eulogizing your husband. Oh, you were such a great guy. Start that. And kari manayach, rend your garments, okay? And sitri mazayach, undo your hair. Okay, and then go ahead and then go in the building and then tell Rabbi Yehuda what you know. So the Gemara says, Afu shikra, they taught her how to lie. So the Gemara says, no. Inu ukra abundance fi'elu. They held like the rabbis that even without all of this demonstration, she would be believed. But they knew that Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't accept it. So therefore, so they figured, they told her what to do in order to get Rabbi Yehuda to allow it, even though, if they didn't feel that they could believe her without this, they wouldn't have told her that. But they felt that they could believe the husband was dead, but this is what she would need to do to get Rabbi Yehuda to paskin that way. Still, though, it's a type of like limdu l'shonam daber sheker, right? It might be that they got the right result, but it was still through going through a whole little role of play acting here. All right, now Beit Hillel Omrim. So this is the basic principle. Remember, is that a woman is believed to say her husband died, which is a big chiddush, right? We've been dealing with this for a few prakim now, but this is where the Gemara directly introduces, right? Way before it was the case of what happens if the husband turned up alive, what's all the consequences? It sort of assumed the principle that we believe the woman to say the husband died. But that basic principle, I know that, but that basic principle that you believe the woman is introduced in this parak. It was only assumed in an earlier parak, right? So this is the parak, and now it's putting some limits on it. Not at a war, not a fight, but it's basically introducing this tremendously big chiddush that you don't need two witnesses, and you can trust the woman, even if she's a nogea b'davar, and even though she's a woman whose testimony normally isn't accepted. So now we're going to see that that this started by a concrete case. And there was a debate of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai what lesson could be learned from that concrete case. And why this next mission is fascinating is it's like a history of halacha, and it's particularly a huge area of rabbinic innovation. And number two is you see that sometimes Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, and you see sometimes later Tanaim inherit psakim of earlier Tanaim, and then debate what the scope of those psakim are. And that's something you actually, if you're sensitive to it, but if you're sensitive to it, you see that coming up a lot in the Mishnayot, a debate of interpreting what the earlier psakim were. So let's take a look. Beit Hillel says, and here again, ironically, Beit Hillel is stringent, at least initially. No, the only time you can believe a woman is like the case in which that served as the precedent for all of this. So what would that be? It has to be like that case. It has to be a woman coming back from the harvest, the grain harvest, and it has to be she's testifying that the event occurred in the same country, that the husband died, right? Basically, not in same city, right? The husband died not in some faraway place, but in his local area, and similar to the story that occurred. Okay, I'm sorry. It has to be like that, like the story that occurred. Amar Beit Shammai said back, it doesn't matter whether he's coming from the wheat harvest, they were out harvesting wheat, and she says that he died. Or they came from harvesting olives, or they came from harvesting grapes, or she came from another distant city, and they say that they were vacationing in Italy, and this happened. The reason that they said that there was a case with a katsir and so on, that was the case that occurred. But that doesn't mean that those are the only times you can apply it, right? Beit Hillel went to like Beit Shammai. And of course, it seems like, as Beit Shammai is going to say, it's like a reductio ad absurdum. Like what? It's going to matter whether they were harvesting wheat or harvesting barley or picking olives. Obviously, you have to abstract it. So we're going to see why Beit Hillel feels that, yes, you can abstract it, but not too much. So let's take a look at the Gemara. Tanya. Well, it's about to say barley.
Well,
we taught it by the quiet people, right? Tanya, exactly. Beit Shammai said to Beit Hillel, if you guys are not prepared to be a little too abstract and generalize, so it should only be a wheat harvest. How about a barley harvest? And I only know harvesting grain. Botzer, Mosek, Goder, Oder, Minayan. How about doing all different types of work out in the field, whether it's getting dates or figs or all these other types of grapes. Anything else? How do you know that would be included? So obviously, it's a little reductive and upsetting. You wouldn't say those details would matter. So if those details don't matter, why do other details matter? So Ella, the story was with the case of a wheat harvest, and it really wouldn't matter. And you would presumably agree to that it doesn't matter what type of food, what type of agricultural product they're harvesting. So once you agree to that, you shouldn't demand that it happen in locally, that it happen in the same city, even if it happened, a woman comes back from a distant city. Beit Hillel would say no. But also Medina, the Shrichi Inchi, there makes a real, maybe it seems like they're conceding, like I might concede that it doesn't make a difference what they exactly were doing, but it does matter if she's coming from a local city or a distant city. If it's a local city, Bosa Medina, the Shrichi Inchi, that people are around, that people would say, what do you mean your husband died? We was there, right? People know who she is and they know who the husband is. So if she said he died in a place where people know him and recognize him, it might, and he didn't die, right? It's very likely she'll get found out. If she said we were traveling in China and he died, nobody knows who that they are in China. So she could get away with lying. Nobody would know that it didn't happen. Okay. So here, if it's in the same city that other people are around, Mirsa, she's afraid to lie because people will see that that's not what happened and they'll know and they'll recognize the husband. Mimdina Limdina Cheres, if she reports that it happened in a distant city, so that nobody is around in that distant city that recognizes them, Lo Mirsa, she wouldn't be afraid to lie. Beit Shammai, what would Beit Shammai say back? So look, maybe the harvest thing shouldn't matter, but there is a big difference between whether it's local or distant. And Beit Shammai would say back, no, there's a lot of travel, there are caravans, and therefore you won't lie even if you make a claim about a distant city because the facts will come out regardless.
And agreed,
okay,
right?
and then in the end, Beit Hillel agreed. Now, Ma Masa Shahaya, what was the original case? The Amar Rav Yudam Shmuel, Shilfi Kitzir Chitim Hayu, was the end of the period of harvesting wheat. The Halchu Asabnei Adam Liktzor Chitim, and 10 people went to harvest the wheat. Nashchu Nachash Le'echad Mehem, a snake bit one of them, Umeis, and he died. Lubasa Ishto Vahudia Lebeiti, and interesting, although there were 10 people there, it's Dafka, the wife, who came and reported to the Beis Din. V'shalchu Matzu Kidvareha, and they went and they investigated and they found out she told the truth. So they didn't just stop believe her. They investigated and they had independent corroboration. But nevertheless, once they found out that a woman did tell the truth in this case, it's quite funny how this led to their psak. It wasn't like they were forced to paskin because they had no other evidence. It's like, oh, look, she told the truth. Let's start believing women. Okay, so I don't really get it. So maybe what they sort of realized is they said to themselves, what if we didn't have the supporting evidence? What would we have done then? And maybe even though they found a way to paskin it because of supporting evidence, it made them realize that they had to come up with a certain principle because there won't always be 10 people around. And what's going to happen to the woman? So that would be pretty powerful, that they just realized what could have happened had they not had it, and that pushed them to establish this principle. Okay, now what, by the way, is the whole issue? Like, why should, it's a little absurd, because in the Mishnah, Beit Hillel does say it does have to be during the harvest. It's one thing to say the same city. So take a look at Tosfos, Lo Dibur B'Katzir LeBehove, Yerushalmi, Lama Katzir, what's special about the time of harvest? Amar Rav Manai, De'unsa D'Shchiach, Amarav Manai de Unsa de Shchiach. Shani Hachama could Dunsa de Shchiach Shani. All right, Dunsa de Shchiach Shani. When there's common likelihood of like accidents and tragedy, it's different. So what would the accident? Maybe we say it's a scythe or something like that, like an accident with the equipment. But Amarav, so the Gemara says, Hachama kodachas pirosha shel adam b'shas katzir. The sun is burning, sunstroke. Right? Sunstroke beaming down on you. Beating down on you, I should say. Hadahu dichsi vayigdal hayeled vayayom vayetzel aviv velakotrim vayom alavi roshi roshi. Right? Remember that case where the kid comes home and whatever by the yeah, exactly, and he dies because of the heat and the sunstroke. Okay. So anyway, back to the Gemara. But that's why Beit Hillel might have even wanted to have limited it to that case. Back to the Gemara. Okay. Name Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva of Rabbanan bepluksa debate Shammai Beit Hillel kamiflagi. We have a similar debate of Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva and the rabbis about whether you apply things to the concrete limited cases or you abstract them, and maybe that's similar to the debate of Beit Hillel Beit Shammai, even though Beit Hillel reversed himself. The time you're telling Brisa, lo yisa adam mechatas ve'ever chatas. A person should not carry, should not carry the ashes of the paraduma, the water for the paraduma, v'avirein biyardeim, and pass them, have them take them over the Jordan River. Okay, ubisfina, or on a boat. The lo yamo b'tzazev yizok b'tzazev. Not only not on a boat can you not pass them over the Jordan, you can't toss them from one side to the next. Or float them on the water like with a raft. And you also cannot, let's say we're not talking about the Jordan. Jordan is too big to do any of this, but presumably another river as well. You cannot go ahead and have an animal, put him on the back of an animal that's going to walk through a river, or have it on the back of a person who's walking through a river. No goat. If the person is walking through the river, it's okay if his feet are touching the bottom of the river. But if he's actually on the animal and he's holding on to it, no. So basically, you cannot pass it over a river, a body of water. It can't pass in the air basically or over the water. It has to be sort of somebody has to be carrying it with their feet on the ground. Okay, so that's what we worried about. It's a good question. So let's take a look. He can walk over a bridge because that's like ground. Okay, his feet are touching ground; they're touching the brick. But touching the deck of a boat wouldn't count. But a bridge is connected to the ground, so that counts. Okay, whether the Jordan or whether any other river. No, the only time it's prohibited is the Jordan River. Ubisvina, and in a boat, not these other ways of getting something over the river. Like the original case. Okay, and we'll find out about an original case where they were taking some ashes of paraduma over the Jordan, and it became tameh, and that led to them to make a more general prohibition. So you see, there's a question about applying things to, like limiting them to their original case or not. So the Gemara says like this. The rabbis who broaden it say like Beit Shammai, Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva, Damar Beit Hillel, Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva who narrows it says like Beit Hillel. So no, the rabbis could say to you, we would say even in theory we could be narrow like Beit Hillel in his case. But why was Beit Hillel narrow in the case of reporting of the death of a husband? That the reason you believe her is she's afraid to lie. And there actually is a logic to the line that Beit Hillel is wrong. Maybe not a logic for a wheat harvest as opposed to other things, but there's a logic between whether it happened locally or it happened far away. She'll be more prepared to lie if it happened far away. She won't be afraid. So that makes sense not to broaden it too much. Okay, but Mali Shanar is here. If we're going to make a problem about transferring something over the Jordan, what difference does it make if it's a Jordan or another river? I mean, we'll see what problem it is in general, but there's no logic to distinguish the Jordan and other rivers. There's a logic to distinguish local versus a distant country. Okay, so that's number one. You can't compare it that way. And Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva Omer, Rabbi Chanina ben Akiva would say to you, I could go even going Beit Shammai who generalizes. The reason Beit Shammai is prepared to generalize in the case of the woman is because a woman will investigate and before she gets married and she'll be afraid of the consequences. So there's a logic to apply that to all cases. Mali makam karv, mali makam rachakum. They're not concerned whether it's local or far away. A woman will always be afraid that she'll be found out and of the consequences, and it'll always. So therefore, there's a reason to generalize there and to abstract. But here, here, what it's basically saying is here, there's not so much of a logic why we forbid this thing anyway. Okay, why can't you transfer the ashes of the paraduma over a body of water? So since there's no logic to it, we might as well apply it to only the very narrow concrete circumstances that it originally occurred. We're not going to, there's a reason. We want the woman to remarry. There's a logic to believe her. So we're going to want to abstract it and apply it broadly. Here, there's no real reason to say it should be a problem. There was just an event that we felt we had to react to. So since it's only arbitrary and we're reacting to an event, we're going to limit it to the specifics of that event. Now, what was that event? Let's just finish. He was transferring the ashes of the paraduma over the Jordan in a boat. And they found a little piece of a human corpse in some section in the boat, and it made everything in the boat tameh, and it made the ashes tameh. So that time they said, don't do this ever again. But there's no real logic. I mean, accidents will always happen, right? So he says, since there's no real logic, of course, I'll say, let's leave this gezerah and this reaction to as limited of an application as possible. But here, of course, we want to make it broader. We want to allow the women to remarry. We have a reason why we want to say this, and there's a logic to be able to apply it in all cases, and therefore we will. And in the end, Beit Hillel winds up ruling like Beit Shammai, which is obviously critically.
But Beit Shammai is the one that says that there's shayrut. So if it really was like one of these like places and not shayrut, they wouldn't say it. They wouldn't believe it.
What?